Welcome back. We're going to kick things. We're going to do the next talk, which is success criteria for your CSPM with David White. As always, I'd like to thank our sponsors, in particular OpenRaven. OpenRaven is the data security posture management company for security teams with modern cloud infrastructures needing to locate and secure sensitive, toxic, and exposed data across clouds at petabyte scale. Enter our Stream Deck raffle, www.2.openraven.com/Valve Steam Deck. Winners will be notified after the event. Q&A, as always, raise your hand. I will come find you, or ask on Slack, YouTube, Mastodon, Twitter. We'll be monitoring all of those. Welcome, David.
Good. Oh, there we go. Cool. So thank you, everybody, for attending Success Criteria for your CSPM. We have a lot of stuff, so I will try to just get right into it. Starting off with who am I? So my name's David White. I work as a senior cloud security engineer over at Nextdoor. You can find me on GitHub and Twitter at 13Scooby. And previously to Nextdoor, I worked at Nordstrom and Disney as cloud security engineer as well. So know the space, enjoy it, love it. Always happy to talk and converse. So if you guys want to meet up, happy to do it. So we're going to start with the agenda. So what does CSPM mean? We're going to understand some of the use case for your environment. Then we're going to talk about configuration management, vulnerability management, and then talk about tips and takeaways. So first, let's get into what does CSPM mean. So CSPM, as you can see on the chart, it's a collection of many different tools. There's different aspects of it. The ones that we're going to focus on most during this talk are asset inventory, misconfigurations, and vulnerabilities. So what CSPM is not. So there's several other tools out there. If you go and do a Google search and you type in CSPM and you go find several of the vendors, they're going to have a products page and they're going to have other tools. CWPP, which is more around workload. There's CNAP, which is the all-encompassing collective. There's SIEM, and then there's more of the application security side, SaaS, DAS, and SCA. A lot of the tools that have CSPM have that integrated into the CSPM tool. However, we're not going to be covering any of that. We're just going to be focusing on the highlights of the CSPM. So very important, what is your use case? So you really want to understand when you go and pick a CSPM tool, how does it fit into your environment? What does your company need? What does your team look like? What are you trying to achieve? And what features are most important? So each environment is different, and so you really need to take into consideration what does your company do? So for instance, what's most critical to your company? Are you focused more on DSPM? Are you focused on doing something like a news feed? It really just depends. You want to figure out what kind of infrastructure you're focused on and capitalize on that. What are the engineering capabilities of your team? Do you tend to be more of the click ops through the web GUI, or are you more IAC and developer focused and engineering focused? That'll have an effect on which tool you end up going with. So it's important to know that and have that in your mind when you're looking and evaluating tools. For your team, you also want to know about your size. How many people do you have working in your security team? How do you hand off the security work to other developers? Does the security team go in and do the fixes themselves? All of these things take time, energy, effort, and so you want to make sure that you understand what is your budget, what is your size, so that you can make the appropriate choice once you come to the evaluation. And then as for the tool, what feature are you looking for? What's important to you? Are there features that one tool has that another doesn't? And then how are you planning on using it? Do you expect the developer teams and the application teams to go into the CSPM tool? Or are you planning to take the security team and then patch that through to something like Jira and hand that off as a Jira ticket to go remediate any misconfigurations you find? And so it really just matters how you're planning to run your security program. Very important to choose the right tool for the right job. If you pick the wrong tool, you end up in a very painful experience. Things don't work out. You bought a tool, you spent a lot of money, things don't come through, and no one wins. So it's important to go through and really make sure that you identify what is going to fit in your environment to avoid all that pain. So some of the things that we used, we broke it down into 5 key factors for tool evaluation. That's review, install, monitor, verify, and confirm. Now, I could leave you with that, but it wouldn't provide you a lot of stuff, so let's dive into each one. So for review, you want to review and understand what the onboarding process of the tool is. So we found that working with vendors, sometimes they would supply CloudFormation templates, and then we would go through and evaluate what was in the CloudFormation template and find that it was either overly permissive IAM rules, or it was asking for multiple lambdas to be created when really only one lambda was needed. And so just because it came from the vendor, you still want to go through and evaluate what you're installing. Review is what permissions are being asked for. Back to the IAM policy example, you want to understand, are you just giving a read-only policy? Are there any actionable write? Are you doing auto remediation? And so we went through and we line itemed each item that we went and installed and tested in our environment and checked against that. Install, we highly encourage you to do a real evaluation in your production environment. Production, I know, is always scary, but it does give you the most real-world use case. Oftentimes when we were working with different vendors, they would show you their demo account and everything works, all the buttons click, everything looks great, but then you realize that when you scale that to 100 accounts, you can run into issues that the demo account didn't have. And so you just want to be aware of that. The closer you get into your environment, the better you're going to get. We found things such as inventory, search features. Different vendors have different ways of search. Some support fuzzy searching, some support using vendor agnostic names. Maybe that's important to you, it was to us. There's the scan frequency. Are you scanning once an hour, once a day, once a week? How often you update the information? What's the accuracy of the information that's returned? Are you reporting on vulnerabilities that are no longer in your environment but haven't gotten refreshed out of the table? You want to know about the quality of the detections that are there. How good are the detections that it's showing you? Just because it shows you 10,000 things wrong in your environment doesn't mean that there's actually 10,000 things of value that you need to go fix. Do they support highly ephemeral environments? Are you a big Kubernetes user and you need to have rapid up down of your pods, and by the time that the tool aggregates all the data and then displays it, is it already out of date because your pod's already shut down? Things that you should be aware of. And then the last two, perimeter scanning and resource connections. Knowing what perimeter and external surface you have is important, so that way you can know how people would get in. And then you want to verify that there's sufficient coverage and confirm that the tool is capable of doing everything that you're expecting it to do. So how do we take that and compare it against multiple vendors? Well, we threw it into the matrix. Not that matrix, this matrix. So we put together, there's a lot here. I'm going to dig through it in the next few slides, but this is our configuration and vulnerability management. You can find it on the Forward Cloud Sec Slack space looking for CSPM. It's publicly shared. You can use it to evaluate your own vendors. We found this most important for our environment, but your environment might be different. So digging into configuration management. Some of the things we looked for were public S3 buckets, unencrypted SNS topics, trust relationships to unknown accounts. So let's dig in and look at the user story. So for each section, we wanted to create a user story so we understood the mindset of what we were trying to get out of it. Then we could map the capabilities and purpose to that. And so in this case, the configuration management reads, as a security engineer, I can identify and prioritize misconfigurations across our cloud environment that could result in stolen or lost data, unauthorized access, or business disruption. I can prioritize findings by exposure and impact for our actual environment, provide clear, concrete, actionable results. So that all the bold stuff is stuff that we really found important. And then we took that user story and we mapped it to capabilities and purposes. So let's dive into each one of these. So AWS resource support is the top. We found out through our environment changing and the tools we were using, one of the things we wanted to focus on was the most coverage in our AWS environment. So we shot for a 90% plus. We ended up dumping our billing and config and resource manager and showed all the resources and AWS types that we had. And then we compared that against what the tool was actually scanning for. Different vendors will have different capabilities and the amount of coverage that they have and the amount of resources that they go after. So it's important to make sure that the resources that you have in use are also compatible and supported by the tool that you end up going with. For Kubernetes support, again, maybe for your environment you don't need that. For us at Nextdoor, we're a very big Kubernetes supporter, and so we wanted to make sure that we had Kubernetes support through and through. So then clear impact. It's important to understand the business risk and understand versus best practice. So just because you have a CIS control that shows that you have a failed CIS control doesn't necessarily mean that that's a business risk for your environment. And so you really want to understand the clear impact of what the vulnerability or what the misconfiguration is and be able to act on it accordingly. Next is root cause fix. You want to dedupe the findings, showing you 10,000 things that could all get fixed with one fix. Doesn't really do anything for anybody. It just creates extra noise, extra stress, and you really want to make sure that you can make the best use of everyone's time. CloudFormation solutions, this one was important because we do everything through IAC at Nextdoor. And so giving somebody a ClickOps solution of going into settings and choosing something to go in and remediate doesn't fit our environment. And so then we need to translate that ClickOps style remediation plan into something that makes sense for the developers so that they can actually go into GitHub, put in their pull request, and get that fixed. Next was real-time security posture and data accuracy. How long does something stay in the dashboard? So in our highly ephemeral environment, by the time it was reported, our pod may have shut down and that application is now gone, but it's still reporting in the dashboard. You want to be aware of that so that you don't end up chasing after something that's not there anymore. And then GUI reliability. How can you go into the GUI? Can you access it? Does it crash? Does it offer you anything? A lot of the vendors are great in this area. You just want to make sure that for your environment and the amount of accounts that you add and the amount of resources you have doesn't crash the application because you have too much. Next, we're going to move on to vulnerability management. So we all know that we all write perfect code the first time, so we're just going to go ahead and skip this section. Hope everybody's okay with that. And then you find out that you have 1 billion critical vulnerabilities in your environment. So when you have that many come in, how do you prioritize what's important? And how do you know which ones are real and really impact on your environment? So we did the same thing. We wrote a user story. As a security engineer, I can identify the vulnerabilities in cloud resources, including hosts, containers, applications, and serverless compute. You can run queries against software versions, SBOMs, or by CVE. You have a low false positive by removing the non-live assets, and software isn't used by the application. And you can prioritize the results by the exposure and sensitivity. So then we map that to capabilities and purposes for vulnerability. Assess the entire environment and assess all infra. And the difference there was whether you have agent or agentless scanning. Do you know that you have scan coverage on all your resources? Do you have agents on everything? How easy is it to tell that you have an agent on something or it's missing from part of your environment? If you rely only on agent-based data and you have compute without agents on it, you basically have a blind eye, and you want to make sure that you have either a compensating control or some other method of finding what those vulnerabilities are. Then we go into low false positive. Now, false positive by my definition or use of it, this is more around the criticality scoring, and we're going to get into that with risk-based prioritization. So just because, like, say you have a base image with Java on it, and it has Log4j on the system, but if you're running only Python apps on the system, it doesn't really have an effect. It's just sitting on the OS, but not actually in memory and in use. So saying that's a critical 9.8 highly exploitable thing, maybe you want to lower that down so you can really focus, especially in a small team, on what's important and what's causing risk to your business. The next was zero-day support. So when something like Log4j comes out, how long does it take for the vendor to realize and be able to scan your environment and have the tools to support it? If you're waiting weeks and the exploit's already public and you have to go write your own tools, the tool isn't working for you, you're working for the tool. So you want to make sure that you understand how quick that company or tool is able to show you in your environment based off something that comes up. Root cause fix is similar to what we talked about before. You want to dedupe the findings into a manageable number so that you're not chasing a bunch of things that don't actually matter, but you understand what the root cause is, and then you can go change one change and affect lots of things and close them out. The next is actionable results. This one I hold near and dear to my heart as a previous developer, and you want a clear call to action. So just going to a developer and saying, hey, you have vulnerabilities in your application doesn't help anybody. What you want to do is be able to clearly articulate, this is where the vulnerability is, here's a recommended fix, but we need you to go into your application and make the change so that this vulnerability that affects you this way is taken care of, rather than just saying, here's a vulnerability in a Jira ticket, go figure it out. So you really want to make sure that the tool provides that action. Next is real-time vulnerability posture. How long does it take to show that the vulnerability has been fixed? If you go through and spend your day fixing all these vulnerabilities and then you go and refresh the dashboard and show your company and the company metrics still show that you have 300 vulnerabilities open, then it doesn't really help anybody and the data isn't accurate, and you want to make sure that the vulnerabilities that you're chasing and spending your time on and reporting on are actually vulnerabilities in your environment. Next, we're going to get into tips and takeaways. So CSPM tool is only as effective if you use it and it fits your environment. So as we know, and as the support of this conference, there's lots of CSPM tools out there. We want to make sure that when you make the choice, you're picking the right one that fits your environment and does the things that you expect for you. Every environment is different. Nextdoor's environment is different from your environment, and so you just want to make sure that the tool you pick fits that. Each vendor will claim that they can do everything and solve all of your problems. It's up to you to determine how accurate that is. And the environments are always changing. Like I said before, we were with a previous vendor for multiple years. As our environment changed and as our environment grew, the tool didn't grow with it. And so at that point, we reevaluated, picked a new tool to fit the new environment, and continued on. You also want to trust but verify the expectation of what the tool is. The tool says it scans 100% of your AWS environment. You want to confirm that all of the resources that you have in your environment are actually being scanned by the tool, not just assume, but trust but verify. And then most importantly, make the tool work for you, don't work for the tool. You're buying this solution to help you and make your life easier. If it ends up being and you spend more of your time correcting all of the things, then nobody really wins, and we just spent all that time and money and effort. So a few things I want to call out here that we found along the way is how easy is it to customize the rules and add your own rules. Some vendors have their own rule language, they have their own lock-in, they don't allow you to export, they don't allow you to see what rules they have. And so it's important if you're going to go in and customize them to fit your environment and truly embrace the full power of the tool, you want to make sure that you can edit and add your own rules. How many rules does the vendor support out of the box? There's some great tools out there, but by default, maybe they only have CIS controls. Does CIS control really address the true core risk of what your business is? Maybe there's some holes. Likely there's some holes. CIS is more of a good start, but not a complete picture. And so you want to make sure that the rules that they provide out of the box to show you things that they know about are available and in the tool. And then scanning 100% of the environment, I've covered that one. And I want to give a couple shout outs. So the Nextdoor security team, the Forward CloudSec Slack, and all the vendors who created the tools and provided feedback. I had a really great experience working with several of the large vendors, several that were sponsors in this event. They all provided great feedback. We would go through, we would evaluate and put them through our matrix and then share those results with the vendors and give them a chance to come back and correct any misunderstanding or anything we may have missed. And it was really nice to get that conversation going and offer our feedback and then get their feedback of something that we may have missed. And so that was awesome, and I really appreciate it. And then in Forward CloudSec, several of you commented when we shared our CSPM, and I just really appreciate the feedback you get from that. So wanted to say thank you to everybody, and we're ready for questions.
Thank you. The matrix itself, a lot of questions on YouTube, Slack, basically every place. Where is the latest updated version? Are you going to continue to update it?
Yeah, I will get it publicly accessible, put it on a link and share that out. Right now, if you go into the Forward CloudSec Slack and search for CSPM, it'll show up, but I will make sure that I get that link out and shared.
The user stories that you wrote, are those part of the matrix, or are they
Yep,
something else?
that'll be on the use
Awesome.
case page, and then it'll go map directly to the capabilities and
Nice.
purpose.
Do you find that most of the user stories are written with a security engineer in mind as the user story, or do you find that there are other audiences for a CSPM tool?
Yeah, so we started with the security engineer in mind, and then made sure that it is a security mind that we wrote it with, and then tried to figure out where the risk in the company was.
Second.
So I was curious if how important was periodic scans versus on-demand scans, or more like real-time or close to real-time detections and response was in this particular case. That was question number one. The second question I had was around this evaluation criteria. Like for us as a practitioner community, does it make sense for us to just have a standard snapshot of all the vendors out there against the evaluation criteria and keep it constantly updated so that every practitioner does not have to go through the same evaluation criteria? Of course, the environments are different. Maybe there are certain portions that are very generic that is worth capturing it, and then you can only spend more time on the specific pieces for your environment, right?
Yeah, both great questions. For the first one, for periodic scanning in our highly ephemeral environment, we were finding that only scanning once every 24 hours wasn't getting us an accurate representation of what was actually in our environment, especially if you have more traffic during the 8 to 5 business hours and you only scan at midnight, you're not getting a full representation of all the compute you have running. And then your second question, I would love if everyone used this template as a starter, but you really want to take this template and put it into your environment and make sure that you capitalize on what you're looking for. Maybe you're like we focus only on AWS, but if you have GCP or Azure, a lot of it's generic enough that you can use it, but I really would encourage you to take this as a starter and then add in things that were specific to your environment to make it better.
Thank you for that talk. When you talk about customizing rules, what's your ideal setup? Is it something like Cloud Custodian? Is it something embedded in the tool, but with some sort of standard language? Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, great question. So at previous roles, we used open source tools like Cloud Custodian. You go in and develop your YAML. And for Nextdoor, what we're doing is we're taking the tools that are there and the rules that are in place, and we're adapting them to fit our environment. So there's a rule, for instance, that says everything is publicly accessible, and it fires and says, we found 500 things, but we have compensating controls such as Okta or an identity proxy or some other form. And so what we do is we take that and we modify it to our environment and say, ignore the things that have compensating controls or lower the criticality of those. And then within the tool and the tool's language, because it's a GraphQL interface, and then we say anything that has a 200 OK that doesn't meet these criteria, that's what we really want to focus on because that's where we see the risk. Did that answer your question? Perfect.
So using a tool like this, we really want to pay it forward, and the amount of work security team does want it to go down over time. So in your experience, especially if you take config management, have you seen after the inception of the tool, you learned a pattern and then started to reduce the number of findings that this provides? Vulnerability, things show up, we keep tackling it. But from a config management perspective, have you guys seen a dip in the number of misconfigurations per se in your environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're very blessed that everything in our production environment is pushed through infrastructure as code. And so when we find these issues, we go back and we change it at the source, and we have the developer team who's building that part of the application implement it, and then we put controls around it to not allow that to happen again. So like public S3 buckets, we can define what the S3 bucket policy should be, and then we put that in place. So then the developer says new bucket, attaches the policy and goes out, and then that reduces that part of the configuration management. So as we find more issues, we really try and work with the other engineering teams so that we can make sure that that issue isn't just, you fix it today and then it shows up tomorrow or next week.
Any other questions? All right, thanks so much,
All
David.
right, thank you.